The blizzard screamed across the Wyoming plain like the wrath of hell itself, and Caleb Rowan knew his best friend was dying. Blood stained the snow beneath them, dark and terrible, while cattle scattered into the white fury around them. "Promise me," Thomas gasped, fingers clutching Caleb's coat with desperate strength. "Find Margaret. Marry her. Don't let her face this world alone." Caleb had sworn off marriage years ago, built his life around solitude and duty. But as Thomas's grip weakened and his breathing rattled, Caleb heard himself speak the words that would change everything. "I give you my word." If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because Margaret Hale isn't the woman anyone expected, and the promise Caleb made in that storm is about to become something neither of them imagined. The storm had been building for 3 days. Caleb Rowan recognized the signs: the particular quality of silence before the wind rose, the way the cattle grew restless in their holding pens, the metallic taste in the air that spoke of snow and violence coming fast from the north. He'd spent 15 years working the high country ranches of Wyoming territory, and he'd learned to read weather the way some men read scripture. But Thomas Brennan had insisted they push the herd another 20 miles before making camp. "Weather'll hold," Thomas had said that morning, squinting at the gray sky with the confidence of a man who'd been ranching since childhood. "We get them to the winter pasture today. We save ourselves a week of hard driving come spring." Caleb had known better. He'd felt it in his bones, in the old shoulder injury that ached when cold was coming. But Thomas was his friend, had been since Caleb first arrived in Wyoming with nothing but a saddle, a rifle, and a reputation for keeping his word. Thomas had given him work when other ranches turned him away, had taught him the difference between surviving the frontier and mastering it. So Caleb had nodded, pulled his hat low, and helped push 300 head of cattle toward the high pasture. The blizzard hit them 6 hours later, swift and merciless. One moment they were driving cattle through cold but manageable conditions. The next, the world disappeared into howling white chaos. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in as many minutes. The cattle panicked, scattering in all directions despite the cowboys' desperate attempts to keep them grouped. Caleb lost sight of Thomas almost immediately. He spent an hour searching through the storm, calling Thomas's name until his throat was raw, following tracks that the wind erased as quickly as they appeared. The cold was brutal, cutting through his layers of wool and leather like they were paper. Ice formed in his beard. His hands went numb even inside his gloves. He found Thomas's horse first, standing riderless near a cluster of rocks, reins trailing in the snow. Then he found Thomas himself, 20 yards away, sprawled in the snow with his leg twisted at an angle that made Caleb's stomach turn. Blood darkened the white ground beneath him, spreading from a wound where a sharp rock had torn through his thigh when the horse had thrown him. "Caleb," Thomas's voice was weak but steady. "Thought maybe you'd miss me in all this white." Caleb dropped to his knees beside his friend, hands already moving to assess the damage. The wound was bad, deep and ragged, bleeding too fast. Thomas's face was pale beneath the weathering of years in the sun, his lips already taking on a bluish tinge that spoke of cold and shock. "We need to get you warm," Caleb said, though even as he spoke he knew the truth. They were miles from shelter, in the middle of a blizzard that showed no signs of letting up. Thomas had lost too much blood. The cold was already claiming him. "Don't!" Thomas caught Caleb's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't waste time on false comfort. We both know how this ends." The wind shrieked around them, driving snow into their faces, stealing what little warmth their bodies still generated. Caleb pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around Thomas, knowing it wouldn't be enough, unable to do nothing. "There's something you need to know," Thomas said. His breathing was labored now, each word an effort. "Something I should have told you months ago." Caleb pressed his hand against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding, but Thomas pushed it away. "Listen to me. There's a woman, Margaret Hale, lives back east in Pennsylvania. We've been writing letters for 2 years. I promised her a future here, promised I'd send for her come spring." Thomas's eyes were intense despite the pain, holding Caleb's gaze with desperate focus. "I was going to marry her, give her a real home, a real life." "Thomas, I need you to promise me something." Thomas's grip on Caleb's arm tightened. Find her. Marry her yourself. Don't let her come out here expecting a husband and find nothing but a grave. The request hit Caleb like a physical blow. Marriage. He'd sworn off the institution years ago after watching his own parents' union destroy them both, his father's drinking, his mother's bitterness, the slow erosion of whatever affection had once existed between them. He'd built his life around independence, around obligations he could meet with work and skill rather than the messy entanglements of the heart. You know I don't believe in marriage, Caleb said, but even as he spoke, the words felt hollow against the weight of what was happening. I know. Thomas coughed, and blood flecked his lips. I know you've got your reasons. But Margaret, she's got nothing back there. Family's gone. She's been working in a textile mill, saving every penny for the chance at something better. I promised her that chance. Don't let my death steal it from her. The blizzard raged around them, indifferent to promises and dying requests. Caleb thought about all the times Thomas had stood by him, when a ranch owner accused him of theft, when a gambling debt threatened to turn violent, when pneumonia nearly killed him that first brutal winter. Thomas had never asked for anything in return. Until now. Promise me, Caleb. Thomas's voice was fading, each word softer than the last. I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs you. But give me your word. You've never broken a promise in your life. Don't start now. Caleb looked at his friend, at the blood staining the snow, at the life draining from eyes that had always held nothing but kindness and faith. He thought about the woman waiting back east, expecting letters that would never come, dreaming of a future that had just died in a Wyoming blizzard. I give you my word, Caleb heard himself say. I'll find her. I'll marry her. I'll make sure she has the life you promised. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. Relief, or maybe peace. Her letters are in my saddlebag. Address is there. Tell her... He paused, struggling for breath. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't keep my promise, but tell her you'll keep it for me. I will. And Caleb? Thomas's voice was barely a whisper now. Don't marry her out of obligation alone. She deserves better than that. She deserves someone who sees her worth. Those were the last words Thomas Brennan spoke. His grip on Caleb's arm loosened. His eyes remained open, staring up at the storm-dark sky, but the life had gone out of them. Caleb sat in the snow beside his friend's body for a long time, snow accumulating on his shoulders, wind cutting through his shirt now that his coat covered Thomas. The cold should have driven him to move, to seek shelter, to save himself. But he couldn't seem to make his body respond to reason. He'd just promised to marry a woman he'd never met. He'd promised to offer her a future when he'd spent years avoiding exactly that kind of commitment. He'd promised because Thomas had asked, and because Caleb Rowan kept his word no matter the cost. Eventually, the cold became impossible to ignore. Caleb stood, muscles stiff and protesting. He couldn't carry Thomas's body in this storm, couldn't even bury him properly. The best he could manage was to mark the spot with Thomas's hat weighted down by stones, so he could return when the weather cleared. He found Thomas's horse still standing near the rocks, patient despite the storm. Caleb retrieved the saddlebag Thomas had mentioned and tied it to his own saddle. Then he mounted and turned his horse toward the south, toward the line camp that should be 5 miles away if he could navigate correctly in the blinding white. The ride nearly killed him. Twice he lost consciousness and woke to find himself still somehow in the saddle, the horse plodding forward through instinct or mercy. The cold penetrated so deep he couldn't feel his feet, his hands, his face. His thoughts became strange and disconnected, memories of his childhood mixing with recent days, Thomas's voice echoing in his head, making promises he couldn't quite remember. He reached the line camp more by luck than navigation. His horse walked straight to the small cabin as if it had been heading there all along. Caleb fell from the saddle into deep snow, crawled to the door, and somehow got it open before unconsciousness claimed him completely. He woke to warmth and pain. The warmth came from a fire someone had built in the cabin stove. The pain came from every part of his body as frozen flesh began to thaw. He lay on the floor near the stove, wrapped in blankets he didn't remember finding, while needles of agony shot through his hands and feet. Easy. A voice came from somewhere nearby, rough and male. You got frostbite in 3 fingers and both big toes. Could have been worse. Caleb turned his head and found Jake Wilson crouched near the stove, feeding wood into the fire. Jake worked the same ranch, a quiet man in his 50s who'd been riding these ranges since before Wyoming was a territory. Thomas? Caleb's voice came out as a rasp. Jake's expression answered before his words did. Saw the marked spot when the storm cleared yesterday. Brought him down to town for proper burial. I'm sorry, Caleb. I know you two were close. Yesterday, Caleb tried to calculate how long he'd been unconscious, how much time had passed since he'd made his promise in the snow. His mind felt sluggish, thoughts moving like cold molasses. How long have I been here? 3 days. I found you the morning after the storm passed. Wasn't sure you'd make it. You were more ice than man when I pulled you inside. 3 days. Thomas had been dead for 3 days, and Caleb had been here unconscious while a promise waited to be kept. I need to get to town, Caleb said, trying to sit up. Pain shot through his feet, and Jake pushed him back down with a firm hand. You need to stay put until those toes heal enough to walk on. Another few days at least, maybe a week. Whatever business you've got in town can wait. But Caleb thought about the letters in Thomas's saddlebag, about a woman in Pennsylvania who might still be waiting for word from a man who would never write again. The promise felt like a weight on his chest, growing heavier with each passing hour. Can you do something for me? Caleb asked. In Thomas's saddlebag, there are letters. I need to read them. Jake retrieved the bag without question and handed it to Caleb. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from weather, were perhaps 24 letters, all addressed to Thomas in a neat, careful hand. Caleb opened the most recent one and began to read. Dear Thomas, your last letter arrived 3 weeks ago, and I've read it so many times the paper is wearing thin at the creases. You write about Wyoming as if it's a promised land, and perhaps for you it is. I confess I find it hard to imagine. I have never been more than 20 miles from the city where I was born. The frontier seems as distant and impossible as the moon, but I think about it constantly. I think about wide skies and clean air, about building something with my own hands rather than tending machines that belong to someone else. The mill takes 12 hours of my days and gives back barely enough to survive. There is no future here, only the slow grinding of days into dust. You ask if I'm certain about coming west to marry a man I've only known through letters. The truth is, I'm not certain about anything except that staying here means dying by inches. Your letters offer hope, not just for a husband, though I won't pretend that isn't part of it, but for a life that belongs to me rather than to the mill owners and their endless hunger for profit. I have saved almost enough for the train fare. By spring, I should have what I need. I know you say you'll send money, but I want to come on my own terms, with my own means. That way, if I arrive and we discover we don't suit after all, I won't be trapped by dependence. I'm not a romantic, Thomas. I don't expect easy happiness or perfect understanding, but I think we might build something real together, something based on respect and shared purpose, rather than poetry and passion. Perhaps that's a cold way to think about marriage, but I've seen too many women destroyed by romantic illusions to trust them. If you're willing to accept a practical woman with scars and opinions and more determination than beauty, then I'm willing to come west and see what we might make of this strange arrangement. Yours in cautious hope, Margaret Hale. Caleb read the letter twice, then reached for another from earlier in their correspondence. He spent hours working through them, watching a relationship develop through ink and paper, two people carefully revealing themselves, building trust across impossible distance. Thomas had written about the ranch, about his dreams of expanding the operation, about wanting partnership more than romance. Margaret had written about her work in the mill, about watching her father die of mill lung, about refusing to let the same fate claim her. Neither of them wrote with flowery language or false sentiment. Instead, their letters were honest, practical, and somehow more intimate for their lack of pretense. In her earliest letters, Margaret mentioned a fire, never directly, always in passing references. Since the fire, she would write, or before my scars. It wasn't until Caleb found a letter from 6 months ago that he learned the truth. You ask about the fire, so I will tell you plainly rather than letting you imagine something worse than reality. There was an accident at the mill 2 years ago. Machinery caught fire, and the flames spread faster than anyone anticipated. I was working the 3rd floor when it happened. Most of us made it out, but I stayed behind to help a girl who'd gotten trapped. We both survived, but not unmarked. The burns on my face and neck healed badly. The doctors did what they could, but I am not the woman I was before the fire, at least not in appearance. I tell you this not to seek sympathy, but because you should know what you're getting if I come west. I will not arrive a pretty bride. I will arrive a scarred one, and I need to know if that changes your offer. Thomas's response, which Caleb found in a separate stack, was characteristically direct. Margaret, I don't care about scars. I care about character, about integrity, about a woman willing to risk herself to help someone weaker. If you're still willing to come west, the offer stands. I need a partner, not a decoration. Caleb set down the letters and stared at the cabin's ceiling. He was beginning to understand the woman he'd promised to marry. Practical, honest, brave enough to write openly about disfigurement to a potential husband. She wasn't expecting romance or rescue. She was expecting partnership and respect. Could he offer her that? Could he keep his promise to Thomas without feeling like he was living a lie? Those must be some letters, Jake observed from his spot by the fire. You've been reading for near 3 hours. They're from Thomas's intended, Caleb said. Woman back east he was planning to marry. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, She know about Thomas yet? No. I need to write to her once I can hold a pen properly. Caleb flexed his bandaged fingers experimentally. The pain was less today, but his hands still felt clumsy and weak. What'll you tell her? It was the question Caleb had been avoiding. He thought about Thomas's final request, about the promise he'd made in the snow. But he also thought about Margaret's letters, about her insistence on coming west on her own terms, about her determination not to be trapped by dependence. The truth, Caleb said finally, that Thomas is dead, that he asked me to honor his promise to her, and that if she still wants to come west, I'll marry her like I said I would. Jake raised his eyebrows. That's a hell of a thing to offer. I gave Thomas my word. Your word won't keep a marriage warm at night. Caleb turned his head to look at Jake directly. According to these letters, she's not expecting warmth. She's expecting partnership and respect that I can offer. Can you? Jake's tone wasn't challenging, just genuinely curious. Everyone knows you swore off marriage years ago. What changed? Thomas died asking me for this, Caleb said simply. That's what changed. It took another week before Caleb could stand without agony shooting through his feet, could hold a pen without his hands shaking. He spent the time reading Margaret's letters again and again, trying to know the woman he'd promised to marry. She wrote about books she'd read, about the other women at the mill, about politics and labor conditions and the slow violence of poverty. She was educated, self-taught, from what Caleb could gather, and sharp-minded in a way that reminded him of Thomas. When he finally could write, he sat at the cabin's small table with a sheet of paper before him and tried to find words adequate to what he needed to say. Miss Hale, I am writing to inform you that Thomas Brennan died 3 weeks ago in a blizzard while moving cattle to winter pasture. He asked me to send you this letter and to tell you he was sorry he couldn't keep his promise to you. Caleb paused, staring at the inadequate words. How did you tell someone their future had died in the snow? How did you follow that news with an offer to take a dead man's place? My name is Caleb Rowan. I worked with Thomas for 15 years, and he was my closest friend. Before he died, he made me promise to find you and offer you the future he promised, a life in Wyoming, free from the mills, and a marriage based on partnership rather than romance. I know this must seem like madness, a stranger offering to honor a dead man's promise. I know you don't know me, and you have no reason to trust my word. But I'm making the offer anyway, because Thomas asked me to, and because I keep my promises. If you choose to come west, I will marry you. I will offer you a home, respect, and a partnership. I will not offer you romance or passion. I don't believe in those things, and I suspect from your letters that you don't either. But I will offer you honesty and my word that I will never raise a hand to you, never prevent you from pursuing your own interests, and never treat you as anything less than an equal partner. If you choose not to come, I will understand. No obligation binds you to a promise made to a man now dead, but if you still want a life beyond the mills, the offer stands. I have enclosed train fare and an address where you can write to me with your decision. Whatever you choose, I wish you well. Caleb Rowan. He read the letter 3 times, changed a few words, then sealed it, and added all the money he'd saved over the past 2 years, enough for train fare and some left over for whatever else she might need. Then he gave it to Jake to post when he next went to town. "You're really doing this," Jake said, turning the letter over in his hands. "I gave my word. And if she comes, if she actually gets on that train and shows up expecting to marry you?" Caleb thought about Thomas dying in the snow, about promises made in storms, about a woman brave enough to write honestly about scars and hard truths. "Then I'll keep my promise," he said, "and we'll figure out the rest as we go." The letter went out on Monday. Caleb returned to work on Tuesday, limping on still healing feet, throwing himself into the physical demands of ranch work to avoid thinking about what he'd set in motion. He told no one except Jake about the letter or the promise. The other ranch hands knew Thomas had died, but they didn't know about Margaret, didn't know about the stranger Caleb had agreed to marry. Winter deepened. The cattle survived better than expected, though they lost about 30 head to the cold and predators. Caleb worked through Christmas without acknowledging the holiday, spent New Year's checking water sources and breaking ice so the herd could drink. He tried not to think about Pennsylvania, about mail coaches moving across frozen country, about a woman reading his letter and making a decision that would change both their lives. The response came in late January, delivered by the mail coach on a day when fresh snow was falling soft and steady. The postmaster in town handed Caleb the envelope with curiosity barely concealed on his weathered face. "Pennsylvania," the postmaster observed. "Don't recall you getting mail from back east before." Caleb took the letter without responding and walked out into the snow. He stood in the street outside the post office, hat collecting white flakes, and opened the envelope with hands that shook slightly despite the healing. "Mr. Rowan, I received your letter yesterday and have spent the night considering your offer. I will be honest. My first instinct was to refuse. The idea of marrying a stranger to honor a dead man's promise seems like something from a penny novel, not real life. But then I remembered that Thomas was real, and his promise to me was real, and the life I'm trying to escape is brutally, exhaustingly real. So I will accept your offer, with conditions. First, I am coming on my own terms, with my own money. I have saved enough for the journey, and I will not arrive in your debt. If we marry and it proves intolerable, I want the means to leave. Second, I expect honesty between us. You write that you don't believe in romance, and neither do I. But I expect respect, and I expect you to treat me as a partner rather than a burden you've inherited. Third, I will not be decorative or docile. I have skills sewing, teaching, basic medicine, and I intend to use them. If you're expecting a woman who will be content to stay in the kitchen and ask no questions, you should write back immediately and tell me not to come. If you can accept these conditions, then I will arrive in Wyoming on March 15th. I hope you meant what you wrote about honoring Thomas's promise, because I am trusting your word with my future. Margaret Hale. Caleb read the letter twice, standing in the falling snow while townspeople moved around him conducting their business. He thought about the conditions she'd laid out, reasonable, clear, designed to protect herself from dependence and exploitation. She was coming prepared to leave if necessary. She was coming with expectations of respect and partnership. He could meet those conditions. He could offer her honesty and respect. He could let her use her skills, could treat her as a partner rather than a decoration or burden. Whether he could offer her anything more than that, whether this practical arrangement could become something real, he didn't know. But he'd given his word to Thomas, and now he'd given it to Margaret. So he would keep his promise and hope. That was enough. March 15th. He had 6 weeks to prepare for a wife he'd never met, to figure out how to honor a promise made in a storm to a dying friend. 6 weeks to transform his solitary life into something that might accommodate partnership. Caleb folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, close to his heart, where Thomas's last words still echoed. Then he turned his face to the falling snow and began walking back toward the ranch, thinking about all the ways a promise could change a life, and wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his existence or the first truly right decision in years. The snow fell steady and soft, covering his tracks as fast as he made them. And somewhere 3,000 miles away, a woman with scars and skills and more determination than beauty was preparing to board a train west, trusting the word of a stranger who'd promised to give her the future a dead man could not. The 6 weeks passed both too quickly and not quickly enough. Caleb found himself caught in a strange suspension between his old life and whatever was coming. The ranch work continued as it always had, feeding cattle, repairing fences damaged by winter storms, breaking ice on water troughs every morning. But underneath the familiar rhythms, anxiety hummed constant and low. He'd never lived with a woman, never shared his space with anyone except briefly during cattle drives or shared bunkhouse nights. His cabin was a bachelor's domain, functional but sparse, with none of the comforts a woman might expect. He spent his evenings after work trying to make it more presentable, though he had little idea what that actually meant. "You're wearing a hole in that floor with all your pacing," Jake observed one night when he'd stopped by with supplies. He watched Caleb rearrange the sparse furniture for the third time that week. "When's she arriving again?" 4 days. Caleb moved the table closer to the window, then reconsidered and moved it back. "I should have asked what she needs. What if the cabin isn't suitable?" "Then she'll tell you, and you'll fix it. Stop worrying about things that haven't happened yet." Jake settled into the cabin's one good chair and pulled out his pipe. "You want my advice?" "Not particularly. I'm giving it anyway. Don't treat her arriving like a problem to solve. Treat it like what it is. Two people trying to figure out how to live together. You can't plan for every possibility, so stop trying." Caleb knew Jake was right, but knowing and feeling were different things. He kept thinking about Margaret's letters, about the intelligence and strength they revealed, and wondering if his plain cabin and plainer life would disappoint her. She was leaving everything familiar, traveling 3,000 miles to marry a stranger based on nothing but letters and a promise made by a dead man. The weight of that trust felt heavier than any promise he'd ever made. On March 14th, Caleb rode into town to meet the stage that would bring Margaret from the train depot 30 miles south. The town was small, 2 streets of businesses, a church, a school, maybe 300 residents total. Everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant everyone knew about the mail-order bride arriving to marry the ranch foreman who'd never shown interest in any woman before. Caleb could feel their curiosity like a physical presence as he tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside to buy supplies. The conversation died the moment he entered, then resumed at a lower volume after he'd moved to the back of the store. "Heard she's arriving today." Mrs. Peterson, the store owner's wife, appeared beside him with the false casualness of someone fishing for information. "Must be exciting, getting married after all these years." "Yes, ma'am." Caleb kept his tone neutral, giving her nothing to work with. "What's she like? Your intended?" "I'll know better after I meet her." Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose at that admission, but before she could ask more questions, her husband called her to help another customer. Caleb paid for his purchases quickly and escaped back to the street. The stage wasn't due until afternoon, but Caleb found himself unable to stay away from the depot. He sat on the bench outside the small building, watching the road and trying to imagine what Margaret looked like. Her letters had mentioned scars, but given no other description. Tall or short, dark-haired or fair. Would he recognize her somehow, or would they stand there like strangers until someone made an introduction? Other townspeople found reasons to pass by the depot throughout the morning. Some nodded to Caleb. Others pretended not to see him while clearly watching from the corners of their eyes. He understood their curiosity. In a town this small, any newcomer was an event. A mail-order bride with scars arriving to marry a man who'd sworn off marriage was practically a spectacle. The stage finally appeared at 3 o'clock, rattling down the main street with dust rising behind it. Caleb stood, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that annoyed him. He was 35 years old, too old to be nervous about meeting a woman. But his hands felt damp inside his gloves, and his throat had gone dry. The stage rolled to a stop in front of the depot. The driver climbed down and opened the door. 2 passengers emerged, a traveling salesman Caleb recognized from previous visits, and an older woman who was immediately claimed by waiting family. Then a 3rd passenger stepped down. Caleb knew her instantly, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the way she moved, careful but not hesitant, taking in her surroundings with sharp attention. Maybe it was something in how she held herself, straight-backed and composed, despite what must have been an exhausting journey. She was taller than he'd expected, perhaps 5.5 feet, with dark hair pulled back severely from her face. She wore a traveling dress of dark gray wool that had seen better days but was scrupulously clean and well maintained, and she was scarred exactly as her letters had described. Burn marks ran down the right side of her face and neck, the skin tight and discolored, pulling her mouth slightly at one corner. She saw him watching and met his gaze directly. Her eyes were dark, assessing, revealing nothing of what she thought or felt. Caleb stepped forward before he could overthink it. "Miss Hale? Mr. Rowan?" It wasn't a question. She studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated and measured against some internal standard. "You look like a man who keeps his word." "I try to." He gestured toward her bags, which the driver was unloading from the stage. "Are these all yours?" "Everything I own." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. 2 small trunks and a carpet bag. Her entire life reduced to what she could carry on a train. "I travel light." They stood there awkwardly while the driver finished with the luggage and the stage pulled away toward the livery. Caleb was aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways, of the whole town bearing witness to this first meeting. Margaret noticed too. She glanced around at the faces quickly hidden behind curtains, then looked back at Caleb with something that might have been amusement. "I seem to be providing entertainment. Small town, not much else to watch." "Then let's give them something worth seeing." She picked up her carpet bag and turned to face him squarely. "I came 3,000 miles to marry you based on a promise and some letters. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I'm standing in the middle of a street being stared at by strangers. So I need you to tell me directly. Are you still willing to go through with this? Or did you write that letter in a moment of grief and hope I wouldn't actually come?" The bluntness caught him off guard, but he appreciated it. No false courtesy, no pretense of romance, just honest need for honest answers. "I'm still willing," he said. "I keep my promises, Miss Hale. I told Thomas I'd do this, and I told you the same. If you want to marry me, I'm ready." "Good." She nodded once, decisive. "Then let's find somewhere private to talk before we make it official. I have questions, and I suspect you do too." Caleb picked up her trunks. They were heavier than they looked, packed tight with everything she valued enough to bring west. "There's a restaurant 2 buildings down. We could get you some food and talk there." "Perfect." They walked down the street together, Caleb carrying her trunks, and Margaret keeping pace beside him with her carpet bag. He could feel the town watching, could imagine the conversations that would fill supper tables that night. But Margaret seemed unconcerned by the attention, her focus entirely on the practical matter of getting food and having a conversation. The restaurant was nearly empty at this hour, the dinner rush not yet started. Caleb chose a table in the back corner away from windows and curious ears. Margaret sat across from him and removed her hat, revealing more of the scarring that tracked up past her hairline. "You're staring," she observed without rancor. "Sorry, you described the scars in your letters, but seeing them is different. Most people look away. You're at least honest about it." She folded her hands on the table and met his eyes. "Let's be direct with each other, Mr. Rowan. We're strangers about to get married. We should at least know what we're agreeing to." The restaurant owner's daughter came to take their order, a young woman named Sarah who'd been 2 grades behind Caleb in the town's small school years ago. She tried not to stare at Margaret and failed, her eyes drawn repeatedly to the scars before flickering away in embarrassment. "Stew for both of us," Caleb said. "Coffee too, and whatever pie you have today." After Sarah left, Margaret leaned forward slightly. "I'll start. What did Thomas tell you about me?" "Nothing. I only learned about you after he died from his letters." Caleb paused, considering how much to share. "I read your correspondence with him. I hope that doesn't offend you. I needed to know who I was writing to." "I'd have done the same." Margaret nodded slowly. "So you know about the fire, about my work at the mill, about why I wanted to leave?" "Yes." "And knowing all that, you still offered to marry me. Why?" It was a fair question. Caleb took his time answering, wanting to give her truth rather than comfort. "Because I promised Thomas I would. Because you wrote in those letters like someone I could respect. And because I don't see why scars should matter when it comes to partnership." "Partnership." Margaret repeated the word like she was testing its weight. That's what you offered in your letter. What does that mean to you specifically? Sarah returned with their coffee before Caleb could answer. He waited until she'd left again, then wrapped his hands around the warm mug and thought about how to explain. It means I won't expect you to be someone you're not. You have skills. You mentioned sewing, teaching, medicine. I won't stop you from using them. It means you'll have a say in decisions that affect both of us, and it means I'll treat your opinions with respect even when I disagree with them. And in exchange, I expect the same: honesty, respect, partnership in building a life, even if it's not the life either of us imagined. Margaret sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. What about the other parts of marriage, the physical parts? The directness startled him, but he matched it. I won't force anything you're not willing to give. If we get to that point, it'll be because we both choose it. Good. She set down her cup. I've been alone a long time, Mr. Rowan. I've learned to take care of myself, to not depend on anyone for things I can do myself. I'm not looking for someone to rescue me or take care of me. I'm looking for someone who will let me take care of myself while we build something together. That suits me fine. I've been alone even longer. Their stew arrived, and they ate in silence for a few minutes. Caleb watched Margaret eat, efficient, no wasted motion, finishing everything on her plate like someone who'd known real hunger and didn't take food for granted. When she reached for the pie, he noticed her hands. They were scarred too, burn marks across the palms and fingers, healed, but still visible. You got those helping someone, he said, remembering that letter. The girl at the mill. Margaret glanced at her hands as if seeing the scars for the first time. Her name was Annie. She was 15. The foreman had positioned her next to machinery that violated safety standards, but she needed the work so she didn't complain. When the fire started, she couldn't get free. Her skirt had caught in the gears. Did she survive? Yes. Married a shopkeeper's son last year and moved to Philadelphia. She writes to me sometimes. Margaret's expression softened slightly. She says I saved her life, but really, I just did what anyone should have done. Not anyone did do it, though. Just you. Someone had to. She finished her pie and pushed the plate away. Is there a preacher in this town? I'd like to get the marriage done today if possible. I'm too tired to wait and too practical to see the point in delay. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not quite fear, not quite anticipation. You're certain? We could wait a few days, let you rest, and get your bearings. I'm certain. I didn't come 3,000 miles to hesitate at the finish line. Margaret's dark eyes held his. Unless you're having second thoughts. No second thoughts, just making sure you have the chance if you need it. I don't need it. She stood, brushing crumbs from her skirt. I'm 28 years old, Mr. Rowan. I've worked in mills since I was 14. I've survived fires and seen good people ground down by poverty and indifference. I know what I want, and I know what I'm willing to accept. If you're offering partnership and respect, I'm ready to be your wife. Caleb rose as well, leaving money on the table for their meal. The preacher lives above the church. We can go there now if you want. I want. They walked through town again, this time with clear purpose in their steps. The sun was lowering toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the dirt street. A few people called greetings to Caleb, their curiosity about Margaret obvious even when they tried to hide it. The church was a simple wooden building at the edge of town, white paint peeling in places but structurally sound. Reverend Martin lived in rooms built onto the back. Caleb knocked on his private door rather than entering through the church proper. Reverend Martin answered wearing shirt sleeves and an expression of mild surprise. He was a thin man in his 60s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that had served him well in a frontier town where life could be brutal. Caleb, I wasn't expecting you. His gaze shifted to Margaret, taking in her travel-worn appearance and scarred face without any visible reaction beyond polite interest. And you must be Miss Hale. Welcome to Wyoming. Thank you, Reverend. We'd like to get married if you're available. Margaret's tone was polite but businesslike. Reverend Martin blinked. Right now? Don't you want time to settle in first, get to know each other a bit? We've been corresponding for some time, Caleb said, which was technically true even if the correspondence hadn't been with him. And we'd both prefer to handle the formalities quickly. The Reverend studied them both for a long moment, and Caleb had the uncomfortable sense of being seen through, as if the older man knew exactly how unusual this situation was and was deciding whether to question it further. "All right," Reverend Martin said finally. "Let me get my coat, and we'll do this properly. You'll need witnesses, though. Church law requires two." "I'll find someone." Caleb stepped back into the street and looked around. Jake was probably at the saloon this time of day, but before he could head that direction, he spotted Mrs. Peterson and her husband closing up their store for the evening. "Mr. Peterson," Caleb called, "could I ask a favor?" 10 minutes later, they stood in the church with Reverend Martin, the Petersons serving as witnesses despite Mrs. Peterson's obvious desire to ask questions that her husband kept quietly discouraging. Late afternoon light filtered through the simple windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Margaret had removed her coat and stood beside Caleb in her gray dress, straight-backed and composed. If she felt any nervousness, she didn't show it. Caleb found himself drawing strength from that composure, letting it steady his own uncertain nerves. "Marriage is a serious covenant," Reverend Martin began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ceremony. "It should not be entered into lightly, but with full understanding of the commitment being made." He looked at each of them in turn, and Caleb wondered if the Reverend could see what they really were. Two strangers bound by a promise made to a dead man, trying to build something real from obligation and hope. "Caleb Rowan, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do." The words came easier than Caleb expected. "Margaret Hale, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "I do." "Do you have rings?" Caleb shook his head, but Margaret reached into her pocket and produced a simple gold band. "Thomas sent this in one of his letters," she said quietly. "He said it was his mother's. I think he'd want it used." Caleb took the ring, his throat suddenly tight. Thomas had never mentioned sending a ring to Margaret, had never said how serious his intentions had been. But here was the evidence. His mother's wedding band, sent 3,000 miles as a promise of a future he hadn't lived to provide. Caleb slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger. It fit perfectly, as if Thomas had somehow known exactly what size she needed. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Martin smiled gently. "You may kiss the bride if you wish." Caleb looked at Margaret, uncertain. They'd agreed on partnership, not romance, but she stepped forward and lifted her face to his, offering him the choice. He bent and pressed his lips to hers briefly, a kiss more of sealing than passion, but real nonetheless. "Congratulations," Mrs. Peterson said, clearly bursting with questions she was too polite to ask in front of the Reverend. They signed the marriage register, their names appearing one after the other in Reverend Martin's neat handwriting. Caleb Rowan. Margaret Hale Rowan. Wife and husband by law, if not yet by anything deeper. "I should give you both some counsel," Reverend Martin said as he blotted the ink. "Marriage between strangers is not an easy road. You'll need patience with each other, and grace for the inevitable misunderstandings. Don't let pride keep you from speaking honestly, and don't let fear keep you from listening truly." "Thank you, Reverend." Margaret shook his hand firmly. "We'll remember that." They walked back out into the evening, married now, bound by law and promise. Caleb's horse waited where he'd tied it, patient despite the hours. He loaded Margaret's trunks while she stood nearby, looking at the darkening sky. "It's different here," she said softly. "The sky. It goes on forever. Gets bigger once you're out of town. Wait until you see it from the ranch." He helped her mount behind him. His horse was used to carrying double on occasion, and she settled onto the saddle with her arms around his waist. It was the closest they'd been to each other, the most intimate contact they'd shared. Caleb could feel her warmth against his back, could smell the dust of travel in her hair mixed with something else. Lavender soap, maybe, or something she used for washing. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. Margaret didn't speak, just held on and looked at the landscape rolling past them. The sun had fully set by the time they reached the cabin, leaving the world painted in shades of dusk. Lamplight glowed from Jake's place half a mile away, but Caleb's cabin was dark. He dismounted and helped Margaret down, then lit the lamp he kept by the door. Warm light filled the single room that was now their home. His bed in one corner, a small stove for cooking and heat, a table with 2 chairs, shelves for supplies and books. Sparse but clean, functional but not welcoming. "I know it's not much," Caleb said, suddenly seeing the space through her eyes and finding it wanting. "I can build on if you need more room." Margaret walked slowly around the cabin, taking in every detail. She ran her fingers along the shelf of books, examined the stove, looked at the bed without any visible reaction. Finally, she turned back to him. "It's fine," she said. "Better than where I've been living. At least here I won't have 6 other women sharing the same space." She set her carpet bag on the table. "About sleeping arrangements." "I'll take the floor," Caleb interrupted. "You take the bed. I've slept on harder ground than this." She studied him for a long moment. "That seems impractical for the long term. We'll figure out something more permanent later. For tonight you're exhausted and you need proper rest." Margaret looked like she might argue, then nodded. "All right, for tonight." She opened her carpet bag and pulled out a nightdress. "I'll need a few minutes to change." Caleb stepped outside to give her privacy and to tend to his horse. The night was cold but clear, stars beginning to emerge in a sky that stretched impossibly wide. He thought about Thomas, who should have been here to welcome Margaret himself. He thought about the promise made in a blizzard, and the woman who'd traveled 3,000 miles to trust the word of a stranger. When he returned inside, Margaret was in her nightdress with her hair loose around her shoulders, the first time he'd seen it unpinned. It was longer than he'd expected, falling nearly to her waist, dark and thick. The scarring on her neck and shoulder was more visible now, but somehow she seemed less guarded this way, more human and real. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping your promise, for meeting me today, for all of it." "You don't have to thank me for keeping my word. That's just basic decency." "Ooh, you'd be surprised how rare basic decency actually is." She climbed into the bed and pulled the blankets up. "Good night, Mr. Rowan." "Caleb, if we're married, you should call me Caleb." "Then good night, Caleb, and you should call me Margaret." "Good night, Margaret." Caleb made a bedroll on the floor near the stove where it would be warmest. He lay awake long after Margaret's breathing had evened into sleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had changed in a single day. This morning he'd been a bachelor. Tonight he was a married man, bound to a woman he barely knew, trying to honor a promise made to a friend who'd believed partnership mattered more than passion. Whether he'd made the right choice, whether they could build something real from this strange beginning, those were questions he couldn't answer yet. But he'd kept his word. Thomas would have approved of that at least. In the darkness, Margaret's quiet breathing was the only sound besides the wind outside. Caleb closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring the real test, learning how to live with a stranger who was now his wife, figuring out how to turn obligation into something that might, eventually, resemble a life worth living. Morning came cold and gray, with frost thick on the windows and the distant sound of cattle lowing for their feed. Caleb woke to find Margaret already dressed and standing by the stove, trying to coax heat from embers that had died sometime in the night. "There's kindling in the box by the door," he said, pushing himself up from the floor. His back ached from the hard ground despite years of sleeping rough during cattle drives. Margaret turned, startled. In the thin morning light, the scars on her face stood out more sharply. "I didn't mean to wake you. I was trying to figure out the stove. It's temperamental, needs dry wood and patience." And Caleb crossed to the stove and rebuilt the fire properly, showing her how to stack the kindling for best airflow. "Coffee's in the tin on the second shelf. Water's in the bucket, but it'll need fresh from the well." "I can get it." "I'll show you where everything is first. No point in you stumbling around trying to figure it out yourself." They moved through the morning routine together with the awkward politeness of strangers. Caleb showed her the well, the storage shed, the small garden plot that would need tending come spring. Margaret asked practical questions and took mental notes, clearly cataloging information for future use. When they finally sat down to breakfast, coffee, and yesterday's biscuits that Caleb had bought in town, the silence stretched uncomfortably between them. I should explain how things work here, Caleb said finally. I work at the Broken Creek Ranch 6 days a week. I leave before dawn, come back around sunset. Sundays are my own time, and I usually spend them handling things around the cabin. Margaret nodded, cradling her coffee cup. What exactly do you do at the ranch? I'm the foreman. I oversee the crew, manage the herd, make decisions about breeding and selling. The owner trusts me to run things day to day. And the pay? Enough. We won't be rich, but we won't starve either. He paused, then added, You mentioned in your letters that you wanted to use your skills. There might be opportunities in town. The school teacher's getting old, and Mrs. Henderson, who does most of the sewing work, has arthritis bad in her hands. I'll look into it. Margaret set down her cup and met his eyes directly. I need to be honest with you about something. I have $43 saved. It's not much, but it's mine, and I'm keeping it separate. If this doesn't work, if we can't make a life together, I need to know I can leave. The words stung more than Caleb expected, but he kept his expression neutral. That's fair. I told you I wouldn't trap you with dependence. I'm not saying I plan to leave. I'm just saying I need the option to exist. Margaret's voice was steady, but not unkind. I've seen too many women stuck in situations they couldn't escape because they had no money of their own. I understand. And I meant what I said yesterday. You're free to work, to keep your own money, to use your skills however you see fit. Something in her posture relaxed slightly. Thank you. I know that's not how most men think about marriage. I'm not most men. Caleb stood and collected their cups. I need to get to the ranch. Will you be all right here alone? I've been taking care of myself for 14 years. I think I can manage. But there was a hint of something else in her voice, maybe uncertainty, maybe loneliness. Although if you could show me where the nearest neighbor lives, just in case something happens. Jake Wilson's place is half a mile south. You can see his lamplight at night. He's trustworthy if you need help. Caleb pulled on his coat and hat. There's venison in the cold storage and potatoes in the bin. Take whatever you need. Margaret walked him to the door. In the morning light, her dark eyes looked almost black. Caleb, thank you for not making this harder than it has to be. Some men would resent a wife who kept her own money. Some men are fools. He settled his hat and stepped out into the cold. I'll be back by dark. The ride to Broken Creek Ranch took 20 minutes through country that was just beginning to wake from winter. Patches of snow still clung to shaded areas, but the worst of the cold had passed. Caleb let his horse set the pace while his mind turned over the strangeness of his new situation. Going to work like always, but now returning home to a wife instead of an empty cabin. The ranch yard was busy with morning activity when he arrived. Cowboys moved between the barn and bunkhouse, preparing for the day's work. Smoke rose from the main house where the owner, Samuel Garrett, lived with his elderly mother. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday, but somehow Caleb felt like he was seeing it all differently, as if marriage had shifted his perspective on familiar ground. Jake intercepted him before he reached the barn. So you actually did it. Got married yesterday. News travels fast. Mrs. Peterson came by the saloon last night, full of information about the wedding and the scarred bride who showed up on the stage. Jake's expression was carefully neutral. She's got the whole town talking. Caleb felt anger kindle in his chest. About Margaret's scars? About the unusual circumstances, mostly. Mail-order bride marrying Thomas's best friend right quick, neither of them knowing each other before yesterday. People are curious, that's all. People should mind their own business. That's not how small towns work, and you know it. Jake fell into step beside Caleb as they headed toward the corral. How is she, your new wife? Practical, strong-minded, not interested in being rescued or coddled. Caleb checked the fence line they'd be riding today. She wants to work, use her skills. I told her about the teaching position and Mrs. Henderson's sewing troubles. Good. Woman like that needs purpose. Jake studied him. You doing all right with this? It's a big change from bachelor life. I gave my word. I'll make it work. They spent the day riding fence lines and checking cattle that had wintered in the near pastures. Hard physical work that left little room for thinking about anything except the tasks at hand. But in the quiet moments between jobs, Caleb found his thoughts drifting back to the cabin, wondering what Margaret was doing, whether she was settling in or regretting her decision to come west. When he rode home that evening, Lamplight already glowed in the cabin windows. He could see Margaret's silhouette moving inside, and something about that simple domestic scene made his chest tighten. He'd lived alone for so long that coming home to light and another person's presence felt both foreign and oddly comforting. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Not dramatically, Margaret hadn't had time or resources for that, but in small ways that made the space feel more lived in. A cloth covered the table. His books had been dusted and reorganized. The floor had been swept clean of the dirt he'd tracked in constantly. Margaret stood at the stove, stirring something that smelled better than anything Caleb usually managed to cook. She'd changed from her traveling dress into something simpler, dark blue cotton with the sleeves rolled up, an apron protecting the front. "You didn't have to clean," Caleb said, hanging up his hat and coat. "I needed something to do. Sitting idle makes me restless." She didn't turn from the stove. "Supper's almost ready. There's water heating if you want to wash up." They ate together at the table, venison stew that Margaret had made from the meat in his cold storage, seasoned better than anything he'd managed on his own. The conversation was sparse but not uncomfortable. Margaret asked about his day. He asked about hers. She'd spent it exploring the cabin's contents, taking inventory of supplies, and walking the perimeter of their property to understand the lay of the land. "I went to see your neighbor Jake," she said, soaking up stew with a piece of bread. "Introduce myself so he'd know who I was if I needed help." "What did you think of him?" "He seems decent. Asked respectful questions, didn't stare at my scars more than most people do." Margaret paused. "He told me about Thomas, how you two were close." Caleb's hand stilled on his spoon. "What did he tell you?" "That Thomas saved your life once in a bar fight gone wrong. That you'd been friends ever since." Her dark eyes met his across the table. "He also said Thomas was a good man who deserved better than dying in a blizzard." "He did deserve better." Caleb set down his spoon, appetite suddenly gone. "I think about that sometimes. If I'd insisted we wait out the storm instead of pushing the herd, he'd still be alive. You'd be marrying the man you were supposed to marry instead of settling for his friend." "Don't." Margaret's voice was sharp. "Don't do that to yourself. Weather happens, accidents happen. You can't carry guilt for circumstances beyond your control. I made him a promise as he was dying. The least I can do is feel something about his death." Feeling something and carrying guilt are different things. She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly, the first time she'd initiated physical contact. "Thomas made his own choices. You're honoring his memory by keeping your word. That's enough." They finished the meal in silence, but it felt different now. Less awkward, more like two people learning to exist in the same space. After supper, Margaret insisted on cleaning up while Caleb tended to evening chores. When he came back inside, she was sitting at the table with a basket of mending she'd apparently found. "These are all yours?" she asked, holding up a shirt with a torn seam. "Haven't had time to fix them properly." "I'll do it. It's what I'm good at." Her needle moved quick and sure through the fabric, stitches small and even. "I was thinking about what you said this morning, about the teaching position and the sewing work. Tomorrow I'd like to go into town and introduce myself properly. Let people know I'm available for work. I can take you in the morning before I head to the ranch." "I'd appreciate that." Margaret tied off a thread and reached for another shirt. "I'll need to establish myself quickly if I'm going to contribute financially." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She looked up from her sewing. "Not because you're demanding it, but because I need to. I told you. I need to know I can take care of myself. That means earning my own money, having my own purpose beyond being someone's wife." Caleb understood that need better than he could articulate. He'd spent his whole adult life building independence, creating a life where he answered to no one except himself and his employer. The idea of being completely dependent on someone else would have terrified him too. The next morning, he took her into town as promised. Margaret had dressed in her better dress, still simple, still practical, but clean and well-maintained. She'd pinned her hair up severely, perhaps trying to draw attention away from her scars, though Caleb doubted it would work. In a town this small, everyone would already know who she was and why she'd come. Their first stop was the schoolhouse, a small building at the edge of town where Miss Sarah Pritchard had been teaching for nearly 30 years. Miss Pritchard was a tiny woman in her 60s, sharp-minded but increasingly frail. She looked up from her desk when Margaret and Caleb entered, surprise and interest warring on her weathered face. "You must be the new Mrs. Rowan," Miss Pritchard said, gesturing them toward chairs. "The whole town's been talking about you." "I'm sure they have." Margaret's tone was dry, but not bitter. "Mr. Rowan mentioned you might need assistance with teaching." "I need more than assistance. I need a replacement." Miss Pritchard set down her pen. "I should have retired 5 years ago, but there was no one else to take over. These children deserve a younger teacher, someone with energy and modern methods." "I'm not formally trained," Margaret admitted, "but I'm educated. I can teach reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography. I worked with the younger girls at the mill, teaching them letters so they could read labor contracts and understand what they were signing." Miss Pritchard's eyebrows rose. "That's more practical than most teaching. Can you handle discipline? Some of the older boys can be difficult." "I managed a floor of 40 women at a textile mill. I think I can handle a classroom of children." A smile tugged at Miss Pritchard's mouth. "I believe you can. When could you start?" "As soon as you need me." They discussed terms. Miss Pritchard would pay Margaret a small salary from the town's education fund while training her, with the intention of Margaret taking over fully by next school term. It wasn't much money, but it was something, and more importantly, it was purposeful work that would give Margaret standing in the community. Their next stop was Mrs. Henderson's house, a tidy cottage near the church. Mrs. Henderson answered the door with gnarled hands that spoke of years of hard work and recent pain. Her eyes widened at the sight of Margaret's scars, but she recovered quickly. "Mrs. Rowan, I heard you were in town. What can I do for you?" "I understand you do sewing work for the community," Margaret said. "I wondered if you might need assistance. I have experience with everything from basic mending to dress construction." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine hope. "Come in, please. Let me show you what I'm working with." Inside, the cottage was filled with partially completed projects, dresses that needed hemming, shirts awaiting buttons, a wedding dress in pieces waiting for assembly. Mrs. Henderson's hands shook as she gestured toward the piles of work. "I used to be able to finish 3 dresses a week," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "Now I'm lucky if I complete one. The arthritis gets worse every year, but people still need clothes, and there's no one else in town who does this work." Margaret picked up the wedding dress pieces and examined them with a critical eye. "This is beautiful work. The stitching is excellent." It was excellent. Now it takes me twice as long and the quality suffers. Mrs. Henderson sank into a chair. "I've been thinking of giving up entirely, but then what would people do? The nearest seamstress is 30 miles away." "What if we worked together?" Margaret suggested. "You could handle the design and cutting, the parts that require experience and skill. I could do the actual stitching and finishing. We'd split the payment based on the work each of us contributes." Mrs. Henderson studied Margaret for a long moment. "You'd be willing to do that? Work for half payment when you could just take over entirely? You've built a reputation here. You have relationships with customers and knowledge of their preferences. That's valuable, and I won't pretend otherwise." Margaret set down the dress pieces. "I'm new here. I need to establish trust. Working with you does that, while also letting you continue work you obviously love." "You're an unusual woman, Mrs. Rowan." "So I've been told." They agreed to try the arrangement, starting with the wedding dress that was needed in 3 weeks. Mrs. Henderson would handle cutting and design decisions. Margaret would do the sewing. They'd split the payment 60-40 in Mrs. Henderson's favor since it was her reputation bringing in the work. By the time Caleb and Margaret left Mrs. Henderson's cottage, it was nearly noon. They walked toward where Caleb had left his horse, and he noticed how people watched them pass, some with open curiosity, others trying to be subtle about their interest. Margaret seemed to notice too, but didn't acknowledge the attention. "That was easier than I expected," she said. "I thought I'd have to work harder to convince them to give me a chance." "You're filling needs that aren't being met. That makes you valuable regardless of what you look like." Caleb paused, then added, "Though I suspect Miss Pritchard and Mrs. Henderson saw past your scars faster than most will. They're practical women. Practicality has no room for vanity or prejudice." Margaret glanced at him. You should get to work. I can walk back to the cabin on my own. It's 4 miles. I have legs. I know how to use them. Caleb recognized that tone. Margaret asserting her independence, reminding him she wasn't helpless. All right, but take water and be careful of the stream crossing. It's running high with snowmelt. I'll be careful. He watched her walk away, straight-backed and purposeful, before mounting his horse and heading toward the ranch. Jake found him an hour later, checking fence posts in the north pasture. Heard your wife's already set herself up with work, Jake said without preamble. Teaching and sewing both. Town's impressed. She's not one to sit idle. No, I imagine not. Jake hammered a loose post back into place. Mrs. Peterson was in the store this morning, telling anyone who'd listen about how capable Mrs. Rowan is. Said the scars don't matter when you see how she handles herself. Caleb felt a flash of protective anger. The scars shouldn't matter at all. In a perfect world, maybe. But this isn't a perfect world, and you know it. Your wife's going to face comments, stares, maybe worse. Question is whether she can handle it. She worked in a textile mill with burn scars on her face and hands. I think she can handle a few small-town gossips. Probably so. Jake moved to the next post. You doing all right with this marriage? I know it's not what you planned for your life. Caleb thought about that question while he worked. Was he all right? He'd expected to resent the intrusion into his solitary existence, expected to feel trapped by obligation. Instead, he found himself curious about Margaret, about her thoughts on the book she'd reorganized, about what she saw when she looked at the Wyoming landscape, about whether the life they were building together might become something more than a promise kept. I'm managing, he said finally. Better than I expected, actually. That's something, at least. The days developed a rhythm. Caleb left early for ranch work. Margaret spent her mornings at the schoolhouse learning from Miss Pritchard, her afternoons doing sewing work for Mrs. Henderson. They ate supper together and talked about their days, carefully at first, then with increasing comfort as they learned each other's communication styles and boundaries. Margaret proved herself quickly. Within 2 weeks, parents were specifically requesting her help with their children's reading. Within a month, Mrs. Henderson was telling everyone in town that Margaret's stitching was better than her own had ever been. The wedding dress they'd completed together was so well executed that 2 more commissions came immediately. Caleb watched his wife establish herself in the community with something approaching awe. She didn't try to charm people or win them over with false warmth. She simply worked hard, kept her promises, and treated everyone with the same straightforward respect. Some people remained uncomfortable with her scars, but most learned to look past them once they saw her competence. One evening, about 6 weeks after their marriage, Caleb came home to find Margaret at the table with papers spread before her doing calculations. She looked up when he entered, and he saw something like triumph in her dark eyes. I've earned enough to contribute to household expenses, she announced. $23 from teaching and sewing combined. I want to give you half for food and supplies. Margaret, you don't have to… We agreed on partnership. Partners contribute equally when they can. She pushed the money across the table. Take it, please. Caleb took the money, understanding that this was important to her, proof that she was carrying her weight, maintaining her independence even within marriage. Thank you. I'll add it to the household fund. Good. Margaret gathered her papers. I've been thinking about something else, too. The cabin's small. You've been sleeping on the floor for 6 weeks, and that's not sustainable. We should discuss permanent sleeping arrangements. The topic had been hovering between them since the wedding, unspoken, but present. Caleb had continued sleeping on the floor because it seemed like the respectful thing to do. But Margaret was right. It wasn't sustainable long-term. What do you suggest? He asked carefully. The bed's large enough for 2 people if we're practical about it. We're married. We live together. Sharing a bed doesn't have to mean anything more than efficient use of space. She met his eyes directly. Unless you're uncomfortable with that. No. If you're comfortable with it, I am too. Then starting tonight, we share the bed. But Caleb? She paused. This is about practical sleeping arrangements. Nothing more, not yet. I need you to understand that. I do understand, and I agree to those terms. That night they lay side by side in the darkness, careful not to touch, both acutely aware of the other's presence. Caleb stared at the ceiling and listened to Margaret's breathing gradually, even into sleep. This strange marriage of theirs was evolving in ways he hadn't anticipated, not toward romance exactly, but toward something that might eventually become genuine partnership. Whether it would ever become more than that, he didn't know. But for now, this was enough. Two people learning to trust each other, building a life together one careful step at a time, honoring a promise made in a storm while discovering they might actually want what they'd agreed to out of obligation. In the darkness, Margaret's presence beside him felt less like an intrusion and more like something he was beginning to depend on, though he wouldn't have admitted that even to himself. Spring came to Wyoming with sudden intensity, transforming the brown landscape into something alive with green and wild flowers. The cattle grew fat on new grass. The ranch work intensified with calving season and preparations for summer grazing. Caleb found himself working longer hours, leaving before dawn and returning well after dark most evenings. Margaret noticed. She didn't complain, but Caleb saw how she'd save his supper warm on the stove, how she'd wait up reading even though exhaustion lined her face. Her own work had expanded too. Miss Pritchard had officially retired, making Margaret the town's sole teacher, and Mrs. Henderson's arthritis had worsened enough that Margaret now handled most of the sewing commissions alone. They were building something together without quite realizing it, not just a marriage, but a life, complete with shared responsibilities and unspoken rituals. Coffee made exactly how each of them preferred it. Books left open at particular pages for the other to find. Small gestures of consideration that accumulated into something that felt almost like belonging. One Saturday evening in late April, Caleb came home to find Margaret standing in the doorway looking troubled. The sun was setting behind her, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but she didn't seem to notice the beauty. "What's wrong?" he asked, dismounting quickly. "There's a situation in town. Mrs. Henderson asked me to tell you about it when you got home." Margaret's hands twisted in her apron. "It's about the Willis family." Caleb knew the Willises. Jim Willis worked occasional ranch jobs when he could stay sober long enough, and his wife Ann did washing for the wealthier families. They had 4 children living in a shack on the edge of town that should have been condemned years ago. "What about them?" "Jim got arrested 2 days ago for public drunkenness and assault. He'll be in jail for at least a month, maybe more. Ann's trying to keep the family going, but she can't manage the washing work and take care of the children and keep food on the table all at once." Margaret met his eyes. "The oldest girl, Emma, is 10. She should be in school, but she stopped coming 3 weeks ago because her father needed her to help with the younger children. That's rough, but I'm not sure what you want me to do about it. I want to bring Emma here." The words came out in a rush, as if Margaret had been holding them back and couldn't contain them anymore. "Not permanently, just during the day while Ann does her washing work. Emma could help me with light chores, I could teach her lessons she's missing, and it would be one less mouth for Ann to worry about feeding during the day." Caleb studied his wife's face in the fading light. Her scars stood out more sharply when she was emotional, the damaged skin flushing different colors than the healthy tissue around it. "You've really thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since Emma stopped coming to school. She's bright, Caleb, really bright. But she's going to lose that if she spends all her time raising her siblings instead of getting an education." Margaret's voice carried an edge of desperation. "I know I should have asked you before making plans, but Mrs. Henderson thought you'd want to know, and I needed to—" "Yes," Caleb interrupted her nervous explanation. Margaret blinked. "Yes?" "Bring her here. Help her. If we can ease the burden on that family even a little bit, we should." He moved past Margaret into the cabin and started pulling off his work gloves. "When would she start?" "Monday, if you're agreeable. I told Mrs. Henderson I'd need to discuss it with you first, but I hoped—" Margaret followed him inside, relief evident in her voice. "Thank you. I know it's asking a lot." "It's asking nothing I'm not willing to give." Caleb hung up his hat and turned to face her. "You care about that girl. That matters." Something shifted in Margaret's expression. Softness mixed with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to understand without lengthy explanation. "She reminds me of myself at that age, smart enough to want more than her circumstances allow, but trapped by family obligation and poverty." "Then we help her, simple as that." Emma Willis arrived Monday morning while Caleb was eating breakfast. She was a thin child with sharp features and wary eyes. Wearing a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. She stood in the doorway like she might bolt at any moment. "Come in, Emma," Margaret said gently. "This is my husband, Mr. Rowan. He knows you'll be spending days here." Emma looked at Caleb with obvious fear. He understood. In her experience, men were likely to be drunk or violent or both. He made himself smaller, non-threatening, and kept his voice quiet. "Morning, Emma. Your ma know you're here?" "Yes, sir." The girl's voice was barely audible. "Good. Mrs. Rowan tells me you're a fine student. That true?" "I like learning, sir. When I can." "Well, you'll get plenty of opportunity here." Caleb finished his coffee and stood, moving carefully to avoid startling her. "I've got to get to work, but you listen to Mrs. Rowan and help her with whatever she needs. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Margaret walked him to the door. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for understanding why this matters." "You've got a good heart, Margaret. I'm learning not to be surprised by that." Over the following weeks, Emma became a fixture in their home. She arrived each morning and stayed until late afternoon, helping Margaret with cooking and cleaning while Margaret taught her reading, arithmetic, and history. The child was hungry for knowledge, absorbing everything Margaret offered and asking for more. Caleb watched his wife transform in Emma's presence. Margaret had always been capable and strong-minded, but with the girl she became softer somehow, patient with mistakes, generous with praise, fierce in her determination to give Emma opportunities the child had never imagined possible. One evening, Caleb came home to find them sitting together at the table, Margaret's hand covering Emma's smaller one while the girl cried quietly. Margaret looked up when he entered, and he saw fury in her eyes, cold, controlled, and absolute. "What happened?" he asked. "Emma's father came home today, drunk. He hit Anne and told Emma she couldn't come here anymore because he needed her at home to take care of the children." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly where it held Emma's. "Anne sent her here anyway, said she'd deal with Jim, but Emma's terrified he'll hurt her mother for defying him." Caleb felt anger kindle in his chest. He'd known Jim Willis was a drunk, but he hadn't realized the man was violent toward his family. Where's he now? Probably at the saloon, spending what little money Anne earned from washing. Caleb grabbed his hat. "I'll be back." "Caleb," Margaret started to rise. "Stay with Emma. I'm just going to have a conversation." He found Jim Willis exactly where he'd expected. At the saloon, 3 drinks deep and getting louder with each one. Willis was a big man gone soft around the middle, with the red nose and broken veins of a dedicated drinker. He looked up when Caleb approached, and wariness flickered across his bleary face. "Rowan, don't often see you in here." "I'm not here to drink." Caleb kept his voice low, aware of the other patrons watching with interest. "I'm here to talk about Emma." "My daughter's none of your business. She's been coming to my home for schooling. That makes her my business." Caleb moved closer, using his height to advantage. "I heard you told Anne that Emma can't come anymore." "Damn right I did. She's got responsibilities at home. Can't be wasting time on reading and such when there's real work to be done. Education isn't a waste. It's the only way Emma's going to have a better life than this." Caleb gestured at the saloon, at Willis himself, a cautionary tale of wasted potential. "You're condemning your daughter to the same poverty you're trapped in." Willis's face darkened. "Who the hell are you to judge how I raise my children? You got no kids of your own, Rowan. You don't understand." "I understand that a real father protects his children, doesn't use them as unpaid labor while he drinks away his wages." Caleb's tone stayed level, but his hands had curled into fists. "And I understand that if you ever lay hands on Anne or those children again, you'll answer to me personally." "That's a threat?" "It's a promise, just like the promise I'm making now. Emma will continue her education whether you approve or not. Anne's already agreed. You can choose to support your family or get in their way, but either way, that girl's getting a chance at something better." Willis half rose from his chair, swaying. "You can't tell me what to do with my own family." Jake Wilson's hand landed heavy on Willis's shoulder, pushing him back down. "He just did. And if you're smart, Jim, you'll listen. Caleb Rowan keeps his promises, good ones and bad ones both." Willis looked between Caleb and Jake, seemed to calculate his odds in a fight, and apparently decided against it. "Fine. The girl can have her damn schooling, But don't come crying to me when she gets ideas above her station and ends up miserable." Caleb left without responding. Outside, the evening air felt clean after the saloon's smoke-filled interior. He stood in the street for a moment, letting his anger cool to something manageable before heading back to the cabin. Margaret was still sitting with Emma when he returned. The girl's tears had stopped, but her eyes were red and swollen. She looked up at Caleb with the kind of desperate hope that made his chest ache. "Your father and I had a conversation," Caleb said carefully. "He's agreed you can continue your schooling here. Your ma already approved, and your pa won't stand in the way." Emma's lip trembled. "You're sure? He won't hurt ma for sending me?" "I'm sure. And if he tries anything, he knows he'll answer to me." Caleb crouched down so he was at Emma's eye level. "You're a smart girl with a bright future ahead of you. Don't let anyone, including your father, make you believe otherwise." After Emma left for home, Margaret turned to Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What did you say to Jim Willis?" "Just that Emma deserves a chance at education, and he needs to stop being an obstacle to his family's well-being." "It was more than that. Emma said you looked like you were ready to fight him." "Well, I was ready to fight him if necessary. He's a drunk who hits his wife and steals opportunities from his children. Men like that need to understand there are consequences." Caleb met Margaret's eyes. "I meant what I said in my letter. I won't raise a hand to you, and I won't stand by while other men abuse women or children. That's not negotiable." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying him in the lamplight. Then she crossed the space between them and did something she'd never done before. She reached up and touched his face, her scarred hand gentle against his cheek. "Thomas chose well when he asked you to keep his promise," she said softly. "You're a better man than you give yourself credit for." The touch lasted only a moment before she pulled away, but Caleb felt it like a brand, warm and startling and significant in ways he couldn't articulate. Something had shifted between them, some invisible barrier dissolving. That night they lay in the shared bed as they had for weeks now, but the careful distance they'd maintained felt different. Margaret's breathing didn't immediately even into sleep. Instead, she spoke into the darkness. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes." "Why did you really swear off marriage? Before Thomas died and asked you to marry me, what made you so determined to stay alone?" Caleb stared at the ceiling, considering whether to give her the easy answer or the true one. Margaret had been honest with him from the beginning. She deserved the same. "My parents," he said finally. "They married young because my mother was pregnant. Neither of them wanted the marriage, but it was expected, so they went through with it. Then they spent the next 20 years making each other miserable. My father drinking to escape, my mother bitter about everything she'd given up, both of them using me as a weapon against the other." He paused, old memories surfacing like stones from deep water. "I watched them destroy each other piece by piece, watched marriage turn two people into enemies trapped under the same roof. I decided early on that I'd never put myself in that position, never marry unless I was certain it would be different. And I was never certain, so I never married. Until Thomas asked you to. Until Thomas asked me to, and I said yes because I owed him, but also because I was scared, terrified actually." Caleb turned his head to look at her in the darkness. "Scared I'd become my father. Scared I'd make you as miserable as my mother was." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And now? Are you still scared?" "Sometimes, but less than I was." He reached out tentatively and found her hand in the darkness, lacing his fingers through hers. "You're not what I expected, Margaret. You're stronger and more capable and more understanding than anyone I've known. Being married to you doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like—" He struggled for words and Margaret finished for him. "Partnership, like we agreed." "Yes, but also something more than that. Something I didn't know I was missing until you arrived." Her hand tightened on his. "I feel that too. When I first came here, I was prepared to maintain careful distance. To be your wife in name and partnership, but nothing deeper. I thought that would be safer, less complicated." She shifted closer, her shoulder touching his. "But you make it impossible to maintain distance. You're kind when I expect cruelty, understanding when I expect judgment, protective when I expect indifference." You defend a child who isn't yours and respect a wife you didn't choose. That's not obligation anymore, Caleb. That's character. They lay together in the darkness, hands clasped, shoulders touching, the closest they'd been since the brief kiss at their wedding. Caleb felt his heart beating hard against his ribs, felt the warmth of Margaret's body beside him, and realized with startling clarity that he wanted this marriage to be real. Not just a promise kept or a partnership maintained, but something chosen and mutual and lasting. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "When I married you, it was because I gave Thomas my word. But if I were choosing now, knowing you, understanding who you are, I'd still choose to marry you. Not from obligation, but because I want to." He felt her go still beside him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this marriage started as a promise to a dying friend, but somewhere along the way it became something I want for myself. You're my wife, Margaret, and I'd like, if you're willing, for that to mean something more than practical partnership." "More like what?" Her voice was careful, guarded. "More like people who choose each other, who build a life together, not because they're obligated to, but because they want to." Caleb rolled onto his side to face her in the darkness. "I'm not promising romance or grand passion. I don't know how to give you those things, but I can promise devotion and loyalty and the kind of love that's built on respect and shared purpose. If that's enough for you, then I'm offering it." Margaret was quiet for so long that Caleb began to think he'd miscalculated badly. Then she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "When I came west, I didn't expect to be happy. I expected to survive, to build a life that was better than the mills, but not necessarily joyful. I expected partnership and respect, but not affection." Her hand found his face in the darkness, tracing the line of his jaw. "You've given me all of that plus something I didn't know I needed. Someone who sees me as I am, scars and sharp edges and all, and values me anyway. That's more than enough, Caleb. That's everything." He kissed her then, properly this time. Not the brief ceremonial kiss from their wedding, but something real and wanting. Margaret kissed him back with equal intensity, her scarred hands tangling in his hair, her body pressing close against his. They came together with the pent-up need of two people who'd been carefully maintaining distance for months, finally allowing themselves to acknowledge what had been building between them. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margaret's head on Caleb's chest and his arms wrapped around her. He could feel her breathing gradually slow, could feel the tension leave her body as exhaustion claimed her. Before she slipped into sleep, she murmured something that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "I choose you too, Caleb, not because of any promise, but because of who you are." He held her while she slept, staring at the cabin ceiling and thinking about promises made in storms and the unexpected ways life could transform obligation into something precious. He'd married Margaret to honor a dying friend's request, but somewhere between that frozen promise and this warm reality, she'd become more than a duty kept. She'd become someone he couldn't imagine living without. The next morning brought rain, soft and steady, the kind that would green up the range and fill the streams. Caleb woke to find Margaret already up, standing at the window watching water run down the glass. She turned when she heard him move, and her expression was different than it had been yesterday, open, unguarded, showing a vulnerability she'd never revealed before. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning." He joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against him, and they stood together watching the rain transform the landscape. "What are you thinking about?" "How strange life is. 6 months ago I was working in a mill, planning to marry a man I'd never met because it was better than the alternative. Now I'm standing in Wyoming with a husband I've actually chosen, watching rain fall on land that feels like home." She turned in his arms to face him. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am that Thomas asked you to keep his promise, and how grateful I am that you're the kind of man who keeps his word. I'm grateful, too, for Thomas's request, for your courage in coming west, for the chance to build this life with you." Caleb kissed her forehead, her scarred cheek, her mouth. "I love you, Margaret. I should have said it last night, but I'm saying it now." Tears welled in her dark eyes. "I love you too, and I'm choosing to stay. Not because I have to, but because I want to. because this life we're building together is better than anything I imagined possible." They stood together at the window while rain fell steady and soft, washing the world clean and new. Outside, spring was transforming Wyoming into something beautiful. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers were discovering what it meant to choose each other freely, to build love on a foundation of respect and shared purpose, to transform a promise made in death into a life celebrated with each ordinary, precious day. The rain continued through the morning, turning the roads to mud and keeping everyone indoors except those with pressing business. Caleb sent word to the ranch that he wouldn't be coming in, the first time he'd voluntarily missed a day of work in 15 years. Samuel Garrett sent back a note saying he understood, with a postscript that made Caleb smile despite himself. "About time you took a day for your wife." Margaret spent the morning teaching Emma while Caleb worked on repairs he'd been putting off for months, fixing a wobbly table leg, replacing worn leather on his saddle, mending tack that had seen better days. He worked within earshot of Margaret's lessons, listening to her patient explanations of fractions and her gentle corrections when Emma made mistakes. The girl was flourishing under Margaret's attention, growing bolder in her questions and more confident in her abilities. Around midday, Ann Willis appeared at the door, soaked from the rain despite her shawl. Margaret invited her in immediately, and Caleb watched as Ann's tired eyes took in the domestic scene. Her daughter bent over a slate practicing letters, Margaret making lunch, Caleb working at the table with his tools spread around him. "I came to thank you," Ann said, her voice rough with emotion. "Both of you. For what you did with Jim, and for giving Emma this chance." "Emma's earned it herself," Margaret said, handing Ann a towel. "She's one of the brightest students I've ever taught. She takes after her grandmother. My mother was educated before she married down, and poverty took everything." Ann looked at her daughter with fierce pride mixed with old grief. "I don't want that for Emma. I want her to have choices I never had." "She will," Caleb said. "If she keeps working like she has been, she'll be ready for higher education in a few years. There are teaching colleges back east that take women." Ann's eyes widened. "I could never afford—" "We'll figure it out when the time comes," Margaret interrupted gently. "Right now, let's focus on giving Emma the foundation she needs. The rest will sort itself out." After Ann left with Emma in tow, Margaret turned to Caleb with determination in her dark eyes. "We should help her. Financially, I mean, when Emma's ready for college." "I was thinking the same thing." Caleb set aside his tools. "We could start saving now, put aside a little each month. By the time Emma's 16 or 17, we'd have enough for at least the first year." "You'd really do that? Help send someone else's child to school?" "She's not just someone else's child anymore. She's part of our life now, part of what we're building together." Caleb reached for Margaret's hand. "Besides, giving Emma opportunities is a way of honoring Thomas. He believed in helping people build better lives. That's what he was trying to do for you when he sent those letters. Helping Emma continues that legacy." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I wish I could have met him, known the man who brought us together." "He would have liked you. You're exactly the kind of person he respected, practical, honest, strong enough to build something real from difficult circumstances." Caleb pulled her close. "He'd be glad about us, I think. Glad his promise became something more than obligation." They stood together in the quiet cabin, holding each other while rain drummed on the roof and the afternoon light filtered gray through the windows. Outside, spring was washing Wyoming clean. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers were learning what it meant to build a life worth living, not just for themselves, but for the community around them. The weeks that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Caleb found himself thinking differently about the future. Not just his own survival and success, but the legacy he and Margaret might leave. They talked about expanding the cabin, adding rooms for the children they might have someday. They discussed buying land of their own, building something that belonged to them rather than working for someone else's dream. Samuel Garrett noticed the change in his foreman. One afternoon in late May, he called Caleb into the ranch office and poured them both whiskey, despite the early hour. "You're different since you married," Garrett observed, settling into his chair. "More settled, like you finally found something worth working for beyond the next paycheck." "Margaret's given me a lot to think about." Caleb sipped his whiskey, savoring the burn. "About what I want from life beyond just getting through it." "Good. Man needs more than work to make life worthwhile." Garrett leaned forward, his weathered face serious. I'm getting old, Caleb. My mother's health is failing and I'm not far behind. I've been thinking about what happens to this ranch when I'm gone. Caleb felt something shift in the air between them. Sir? I've got no children, no close family who'd want to take over a Wyoming cattle operation, but I've got a foreman who's run this place better than I could for the past decade. Garrett met Caleb's eyes. I'm proposing a partnership. You buy into the ranch now, say 30%, with the understanding that when I die, the rest transfers to you. We'll work out terms that make it affordable, payments over time from your earnings. The offer hit Caleb like a physical blow. Ownership. Not just working someone else's land, but owning it himself, building something permanent that could be passed down. That's incredibly generous. It's practical. You've earned it. And I need to know this place will be in good hands when I'm gone. Garrett refilled both their glasses. Talk it over with your wife. If she agrees, we'll draw up papers next week. Caleb rode home that evening with his mind racing through possibilities. Partnership in the ranch meant stability, meant opportunities for growth and expansion. It meant he could offer Margaret more than just a foreman's cabin. He could offer her a real home, a real stake in the land they were building their life on. Margaret was waiting when he arrived, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and a smile playing at her scarred mouth. You look like a man with news. Samuel Garrett offered me a partnership in the ranch. 30% now, the rest when he dies. Caleb dismounted and pulled her into his arms, needing to feel her solid presence while the enormity of the opportunity settled over him. It's a chance to own something, Margaret, to build real security for us. Then we accept. She said it without hesitation, without needing to discuss terms or calculate risks. This is what you've been working toward your whole life. Of course we accept. It'll mean tighter finances for a while. Most of my earnings will go toward buying in, paying off the partnership stake. We'll manage. We've both lived on less before. Margaret pulled back to look at him directly. This is our future, Caleb. Our chance to build something that lasts beyond just us. I'm not going to let fear of temporary difficulty stop us from seizing it. They drew up papers the following week with the town's lawyer present to ensure everything was legal and binding. Caleb signed his name, feeling the weight of commitment and possibility in equal measure. He was no longer just the foreman of Broken Creek Ranch. He was part owner, with a path toward full ownership that would secure his and Margaret's future. The town noticed the change in Caleb and Margaret Rowan's circumstances. Some people celebrated their success. Others whispered about the scarred mail-order bride who'd landed on her feet with suspicious speed. Margaret heard the gossip but didn't let it touch her. She had work to do and a life to build. Other people's jealousy was their problem, not hers. Summer came with its particular intensity, long days of hard work under brutal sun, cattle drives to higher pasture, endless repairs and improvements. Margaret took over the schoolhouse completely when Miss Pritchard moved east to live with her sister. She also expanded her sewing business, taking on 3 apprentices from among the town's young women who needed skills and income. Emma Willis continued to flourish. By midsummer, she was reading at a level far beyond her age, tackling books from Caleb and Margaret's growing library with voracious appetite. Her father had stopped drinking as much after his confrontation with Caleb, though Anne confided to Margaret that the change was fragile and could reverse at any moment. One evening in July, Margaret came home from town with a letter in her hand and tears on her face. Caleb dropped the fence post he'd been carrying and rushed to her side. What happened? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Margaret's voice shook with emotion. Read this. The letter was from a woman named Annie Reynolds in Philadelphia, the girl Margaret had saved from the mill fire. Caleb scanned the neat handwriting quickly, then more slowly as the contents registered. Annie was writing to tell Margaret that she'd named her newborn daughter Margaret Ann, after the woman who'd saved her life and given her a future. The letter included a small daguerreotype of Annie holding her baby, both of them healthy and smiling. She remembers, Margaret whispered. After all these years, she still remembers what I did for her. Caleb pulled his wife close, feeling her shake with the force of emotions she usually kept tightly controlled. Of course she remembers. You changed her life, some things you don't forget. I just did what anyone should have done. But not everyone did do it. You did. He kissed the top of her head. You saved her, Margaret, and now she's honoring you by passing your name to her daughter. That's legacy. That's what matters. They stood together in the fading light, holding each other while Margaret cried tears of joy and gratitude and remembered pain. Later, she would frame the daguerreotype and place it on the shelf beside their wedding certificate and Thomas's letters. But for now, she just let herself feel the weight of being remembered, of knowing her courage had mattered in ways she'd never expected. August brought the first real test of Caleb and Margaret's partnership in the ranch. A neighboring spread tried to claim water rights to a stream that ran through Broken Creek land, threatening legal action if Samuel Garrett didn't concede. The dispute could have bankrupted them in legal fees, could have destroyed everything they were building. Margaret attended the town meeting where the issue was being discussed, the only woman present besides the clerk taking minutes. She listened to the arguments from both sides, then stood and asked for permission to speak. The room fell silent, men exchanging glances that ranged from curious to dismissive. "I've reviewed the territorial land grants," Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. "The water rights were explicitly assigned to Broken Creek Ranch in 1867. The neighboring ranch's claim is based on a misreading of the boundary descriptions." She produced documents she'd obtained from the territorial office, pointing out the specific language that proved Broken Creek's claim. "If this goes to court, you'll lose. But more than that, you'll establish a precedent that makes everyone's water rights vulnerable to challenge based on creative interpretation. That serves no one's interests." The neighbor's lawyer sputtered objections, but Margaret's logic was unassailable. The documents were clear. The territorial clerk confirmed her interpretation. By the end of the meeting, the neighboring ranch had withdrawn their claim, and men who'd dismissed Margaret as just a scarred mail-order bride were reassessing their opinions. Caleb waited outside the meeting hall for her, pride evident in his expression. "You just saved us thousands in legal fees." "I just read the documents and applied common sense." But Margaret was smiling, clearly pleased with herself. "Though I'll admit it felt good to use my education for something besides teaching fractions to children. You're remarkable. You know that? I'm practical. There's a difference." "There's not." He took her hand as they walked through the warm evening toward home. "You see problems and solve them. You help people who need help. You stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. That's not just practical, that's remarkable." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You see me more clearly than anyone ever has. That's remarkable too." As summer gave way to fall, Caleb and Margaret's life together deepened into something neither of them had quite anticipated. The work was hard. Ranch work always was. But they faced it together, making decisions as partners and supporting each other through difficulties. The cabin they'd once shared as strangers became a home filled with books and laughter, and the comfortable silences of people who understood each other. Emma continued her education, now helping Margaret teach the younger students in exchange for more advanced lessons. Ann Willis found better-paying work when one of the town's wealthier families hired her as a full-time housekeeper, providing steady income and respect her washing work never had. Jim Willis remained sober more often than not, though everyone knew the struggle was ongoing. One October evening, Margaret and Caleb sat together on the porch they'd built onto the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Margaret had been quiet all day, and Caleb could sense something weighing on her mind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked finally. Margaret was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I'm thinking about Thomas, about how he brought us together with his dying request. I'm thinking that I should be sad I never got to meet him, but instead I'm just grateful." She turned to look at Caleb, her dark eyes serious. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he'd survived? If you hadn't had to keep that promise?" "Sometimes," Caleb admitted. "But I don't think it changes anything important. Thomas saw something in you through your letters, something real and valuable. And he knew me well enough to understand that if I gave my word to marry you, I'd treat you with respect and honesty. He wasn't wrong about either of us." "No, he wasn't." Margaret leaned against Caleb's shoulder. "I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he asked you to keep his promise. He was giving us both a chance at something better than we'd have found on our own. Maybe. Or maybe he just trusted that two practical people would figure out how to build something real from an impossible situation." Caleb wrapped his arm around her. "Either way, I'm grateful. For his request, for your courage in accepting it, for everything that's come from that promise made in a blizzard." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. Inside the cabin, lamps waited to be lit and supper waited to be made. But for now, they stayed where they were, two people who'd started as strangers and become something far more precious. Partners, lovers, friends who'd chosen each other freely and built a life worth living from the ashes of grief and the foundation of kept promises. Winter returned with the first snow in early November. Caleb stood at the window one morning watching flakes fall soft and steady, remembering another storm nearly a year ago when he'd knelt beside a dying friend and made a promise that changed everything. Thomas's voice seemed to echo in his memory, asking him to find Margaret and give her the future he couldn't provide. Margaret came to stand beside him, following his gaze to the falling snow. She didn't ask what he was thinking. After months of marriage, she'd learned to read his silences and understand when his thoughts turned to Thomas. "I want to do something," Caleb said quietly, "to honor him properly, to acknowledge what his request gave us." "What did you have in mind?" "There's a box of his things, letters, a few personal items, that I kept after he died. One of them is a pocket watch his father gave him. It meant a lot to Thomas." Caleb turned to face Margaret. "I want to give it to Emma when she finishes her education. As a reminder that one person's faith in another can change lives, that promises kept can ripple out in ways we never expect." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He'd like that, knowing his legacy was helping a girl get the education he wanted for me. He'd like knowing his promise brought us together too, that we built something real from his final request." Caleb pulled her close. "I think about that sometimes, how he trusted me to take care of you, and how that trust gave us both something we didn't know we needed. He was a good man. The best I knew, and he's gone, but what he started continues. That's a kind of immortality, I think, living on in the lives you've touched and the changes you've set in motion." They stood together at the window while snow fell like a benediction, covering the land in white and transforming the familiar landscape into something new. Caleb thought about promises and how they could bind people together across the barrier of death. He thought about Thomas lying in the snow, asking him to marry a stranger and give her the life he couldn't. He thought about all the ways that impossible request had transformed into something precious and real. Spring came again with its annual miracle of renewal. The cattle survived the winter well. The ranch prospered under Caleb's expanding ownership, and Margaret's reputation as both teacher and seamstress grew to the point where women traveled from surrounding towns to commission her work or seek her teaching. Emma Willis, now 12, was reading philosophy and advanced mathematics. She'd grown taller, losing some of the wary thinness that had marked her when she first came to Caleb and Margaret's home. She had dreams now, specific, achievable dreams of teaching college someday, of writing books, of using education to lift other girls out of the poverty that had nearly trapped her. One warm afternoon in May, nearly a year and a half after Margaret had first arrived in Wyoming, Caleb came home to find his wife standing in the garden they'd planted together, her hands on her belly and a strange expression on her face. "Margaret, what's wrong?" She turned to him with wonder in her dark eyes. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right, actually." She reached for his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I'm pregnant, Caleb. We're going to have a child." The news hit him with the force of revelation. A child. His child. Margaret's child. A life they'd created together from love that had started as obligation and transformed into something neither of them had quite believed possible. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I've suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you." Margaret's voice shook slightly. "I know we haven't talked about children much, and I know this changes our plans." Caleb kissed her to stop the nervous words. "This doesn't change our plans. This fulfills them. We've been building a life together, building something that will outlast us. A child is the ultimate expression of that." Margaret laughed, tears streaming down her scarred face. "You're not frightened? Because I'm terrified. What if I can't do this? What if you saved a girl from a burning mill? You traveled 3,000 miles to marry a stranger. You stood up to drunk men and town gossips, and your own fear." Caleb framed her face with his hands. "You're the bravest person I know, Margaret. You can do this. We can do this together." They stood in their garden while spring flowers bloomed around them and the sun warmed their faces, holding each other and marveling at the life growing between them. This child would be born from love that had started as a promise made in a storm, born from two people who'd learned to choose each other freely, born into a life built on respect and partnership and the kind of devotion that came from truly seeing and valuing another person. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Margaret continued teaching until she grew too large to stand comfortably for long periods, then shifted to working with advanced students at home, while Emma and one of Margaret's other apprentices handled the younger children. The sewing work she delegated entirely, trusting her apprentices to maintain the quality standards she'd established. Caleb found himself thinking about his own father, about the man who'd resented his existence and used him as a weapon against his mother. He was determined to be different, to give this child what he'd never had, a father who wanted him, who saw his existence as joy rather than burden, who would build him up rather than tear him down. One evening in late August, with Margaret's belly round and the baby kicking visibly beneath her dress, Caleb finally opened Thomas's box of belongings. He'd kept it sealed since the funeral, unable to face the contents. But now felt like the right time. Now, when they were about to bring new life into the world. Now when Thomas's promise had transformed into something beautiful and lasting. Inside were letters, including some Margaret had written that Thomas never got to answer. There was the pocket watch Caleb planned to give Emma. There was a small leather journal where Thomas had documented his plans for the ranch he had hoped to build with Margaret. And there, at the bottom, was something Caleb hadn't expected. A letter addressed to him in Thomas's handwriting, marked, "To be opened after my death." With shaking hands, Caleb opened the envelope and read, "Caleb, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've kept your promise to marry Margaret. I knew you would. You've never broken your word in all the years I've known you. I want you to know that asking you to marry her wasn't just about giving her security. It was about giving you both a chance at something I saw you needed but couldn't ask for directly. You've spent 15 years alone, Caleb, protecting yourself from the kind of pain your parents' marriage caused. And Margaret spent years surviving rather than living, protecting herself from dependence and vulnerability. I thought maybe you could help each other. Maybe you could build something real from practical partnership. Maybe you could learn to trust again, both of you. If I'm wrong, if this letter finds you trapped in a miserable marriage you only kept out of obligation to me, I'm sorry. But I don't think I'm wrong. I think you'll be good for each other. I think you'll build something worth having. Take care of her, Caleb. Take care of yourself. And don't waste time on guilt or regret. I live my life the way I chose to live it. And if it ended sooner than expected, that's not your fault or anyone's. That's just life on the frontier. Your friend always, Thomas." Caleb read the letter 3 times, tears blurring his vision. Thomas had known. Somehow he'd known that Caleb and Margaret would be good for each other, that they'd build something real from the impossible circumstances of his dying request. He'd engineered their meeting not just to protect Margaret, but to give them both a chance at the kind of life neither had believed possible. Margaret found him sitting with the letter, and he handed it to her without speaking. She read it slowly, her own tears falling onto the paper. When she finished, she sat beside him and took his hand. "He gave us a gift," she said softly. "Not just the marriage itself, but the chance to discover what we could become together. We thought we were honoring his promise, but really he was honoring us, trusting us to find each other. I wish he could see what we've built, see the baby coming, see Emma's success, see how his promise transformed into all of this." "Maybe he can." Margaret placed Caleb's hand on her belly where the baby was moving. "Maybe that's what legacy means. Living on in the lives you've touched and the futures you've made possible. He's part of this child, part of Emma's education, part of everything we've become. That's a kind of immortality." Their daughter was born on a cold October morning, arriving fast and healthy with a cry that filled the cabin with sound and life. Margaret labored hard but well, supported by the midwife and by Caleb's steady presence. When the baby was finally placed in Margaret's arms, Caleb looked at his wife and daughter together and felt something unlock in his chest. A capacity for love he hadn't known he possessed, a joy so intense it felt almost like pain. "What should we name her?" Margaret asked, exhausted but radiant. Caleb had been thinking about this for months. "I'd like to call her Hope, because that's what she represents. Hope that the future can be better than the past. Hope that promises kept can transform into joy. Hope that two broken people can build something whole together. Margaret smiled through her tears. Hope Margaret Rowan. I like that. They sat together with their daughter, between them, this tiny life they'd created from love that had started as obligation and transformed into something neither of them had quite anticipated. Outside, autumn was painting Wyoming in shades of gold and crimson. Inside, a family was beginning, built on the foundation of a promise made in a storm, sustained by respect and partnership, and blessed with the kind of love that came from truly choosing each other. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and changes. The ranch prospered, expanding under Caleb's ownership until it became one of the most successful operations in the territory. Margaret's school grew to serve children from 3 surrounding towns, and her apprenticeship program helped dozens of young women learn skills that gave them independence and opportunities. Emma Willis went east for college at 16, funded by the education fund Caleb and Margaret had built for her, and returned 5 years later with teaching credentials and plans to start a school for girls from poor families. Jim Willis died in Margaret and Caleb's 5th year of marriage, his liver finally giving out after too many years of abuse. Anne remarried a year later to the town's carpenter, a kind man who treated her and her remaining children with the respect Jim never had. At the wedding, Anne sought out Margaret and Caleb to thank them again for saving Emma's future. "She's everything I hoped she'd be," Anne said, tears in her eyes, "and it's because you believed in her when her own father couldn't." Samuel Garrett passed peacefully in his sleep 7 years after offering Caleb the partnership, leaving Broken Creek Ranch entirely in Caleb's hands as promised. Caleb ran it with Margaret's partnership and counsel, making decisions together about expansion and improvement, building something that would last beyond their own lives. More children came, 2 sons and another daughter, each one healthy and loved and raised to understand that promises mattered, that respect was the foundation of all relationships, and that partnership built on honesty was worth more than romance built on illusions. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Caleb and Margaret stood together in the spot where he'd first brought her home as his wife. The cabin had been expanded into a proper house now, with rooms for their growing family and space for the life they'd built together. The land around them showed the marks of their stewardship: improved pastures, new buildings, fences that ran straight and true across acres they owned outright. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked, pulling Margaret close. "Coming west to marry a stranger based on a dying man's promise?" Margaret looked up at him, her scarred face as beautiful to him now as any face he'd ever seen. "Not for a single moment. Coming here was the bravest thing I ever did, and marrying you was the smartest. Everything good in my life comes from that decision. Everything good in mine comes from Thomas's request and your courage in accepting it." Caleb kissed her forehead. "We started with a promise made in a storm. We built something that's weathered every storm since." Not just weathered, thrived. Margaret gestured at their land, their home, their life together. "We took impossible circumstances and transformed them into something beautiful. That's not just surviving, that's victory." That night, after their children were asleep and the house was quiet, Caleb took Thomas's pocket watch from the box where he'd kept it safe for a decade. He'd given it to Emma at her college graduation as planned, but she'd insisted on returning it when she came home to start her school, saying it belonged with the family that had honored Thomas's memory by building something beautiful from his final request. Caleb held the watch in his hand, feeling its weight, thinking about the man who'd owned it and the promise that man had extracted in a Wyoming blizzard. Thomas had been gone for more than a decade now, but his presence was still felt in every aspect of Caleb and Margaret's life together. The promise he'd requested had rippled out in ways none of them could have predicted, saving Emma's future, building a prosperous ranch, creating a family, establishing schools and opportunities that would benefit the community for generations. Margaret came to stand beside him, following his thoughts as she so often did after years of marriage. "He'd be proud of us." "I hope so. I hope he knows what his promise became." "I think he does. I think that's what it means to keep a promise, to let it grow beyond the original words into something larger and more beautiful than anyone imagined." Margaret took the watch from Caleb's hand and set it on the shelf beside their family photographs. "He asked you to give me a future. Instead, you gave us both one. That's more than keeping a promise. that's honoring it. They stood together in the quiet house they'd built from obligation and transformed into home. Outside, Wyoming stretched vast under stars that had witnessed a promise made in death and kept in life. Inside, two people who'd started as strangers held each other, grateful for storms and promises and the unexpected ways love could grow from the least likely soil. The promise made in that long-ago blizzard had been kept, not just in letter, but in spirit, not just in obligation, but in joy. Thomas Brennan had died asking his friend to marry the woman he'd promised a future, and that friend had kept his word. But more than that, Caleb Rowan had taken an impossible request and transformed it into something precious, a life built on respect and partnership, a love grown from honesty and shared purpose, a legacy that would outlast them all. And on cold winter nights when snow fell soft and steady over Wyoming, when the wind howled like it had that night Thomas died, Caleb would stand at the window with Margaret beside him and think about promises, about how the best ones weren't just kept but exceeded, about how obligation could transform into devotion, strangers into soulmates, and a request made in desperation into a life worth celebrating. The promise had been fulfilled, the life had been built, and the love that started as duty had become something neither Caleb nor Margaret could imagine living without, a partnership forged in grief, sustained by respect, and blessed with the kind of joy that only came from choosing each other freely, every single day, for the rest of their lives.